In today's episode, an experienced outdoorsman has a surprise run-in with a grizzly bear, and it went into attack mode. Caught completely unarmed, the man is powerless against the bear's attack. Hit that like button and subscribe right now. This is the terrifying grizzly bear attack on Max Tiley. Welcome to Final Affliction. Josie and Max Tiley were two peas in a pod ever since Josie graduated high school. Even now, at 63 and 70 years old, the two were still going on adventures. Max had grown up hunting caribou, groundhogs, moose, deer, or whatever was in season at the time. His excellent tracking and trapping skills made him a fair bit of change on the side. Very rarely did he go out without his wife. When they started dating, Josie pretended to be interested in hunting, mostly to impress the handsome older boy. But to her surprise, she absolutely loved the outdoors, and she was shaping up to be just as good at tracking, trapping, and hunting as her husband. They always joke that the only time that Josie didn't join in on a hunt was when she was giving birth to one of their 7 children. As soon as that baby was born, you could find her out dressing a buck in the field with a newborn baby strapped to her back. Together they raised their children to love and respect nature just as much as they did, and the rich Native American culture that came with it. As Max looked at his children and grandchildren, he knew that their ancestors must have been proud of the couple for having such a large, thriving, and healthy family to call their own. When they retired, they decided to go back to McCloud Lake Reservation, where they'd grown up. Most weekends, Max would teach his grandkids to hunt, and Josie would show them to process whatever kill they brought home. September 2005 was a rare weekend without any of the grandchildren staying over, and Max thought the house seemed rather empty without their laughter and antics. So he and Josie went out for a few long drives to do some scouting. They wanted to fill their freezers before the winter settled in completely. It would have been nice to have one of the kids or older grandchildren around to make the job go faster, but they were more than happy to soak up each other's company alone for a change, even if that meant processing a moose on their own. It's not like they hadn't done it a million times before. On Sunday afternoon, they set out looking for a promising spot to start searching for tracks. It wasn't until late afternoon that Max finally saw a crop of trees that he remembered had a stream going through it. A buck of some sort was bound to come around for a drink of water. All they had to do was set up a viewpoint and wait. The stream was no more than 200 yards away from the road, so getting their kill back to the truck wouldn't be too hard either. It was the perfect place for the elderly couple to bring something down without help. Leaving Josie in the car, Max hopped out of the truck and walked out to the footpath that was already trodden out by other hunters and animals that kept close to the stream. But Max, who'd hunted for 60 years, forgot to bring his rifle along. He was just planning to take a quick look around to see if there was enough activity in the area to make it worth their while, head back to his wife in the car, and they'd return the next morning to set up a place where they could hunt. He never left his rifle behind, not even if he was just going out for a few minutes. After all, no one knew better than Max how dangerous it could be out there. But for some inexplicable reason, this was the one time Max forgot to take his rifle along with him. Unfortunately for Max, it wasn't just the herbivores visiting that stream to get a drink of water. Every coyote, every cougar, and every grizzly in the area was using it too. And that was exactly what Max walked into. A fully grown adult male grizzly, so big that any wildlife enthusiast would have been impressed by it. The bear drew itself up on its hind legs to display its full height when it was so suddenly surprised down the forest path. Max opened his mouth to scream, but before he could get a sound out, his face was met with a murderous swipe. Claws extended, the animal's talons raked across Max's head. He went flying through the air, finally giving in to the scream that had been building up in his chest. But this time it wasn't for shock and fear like it was a moment ago. Instead, it was for the blinding pain that seared across his forehead. It was truly and completely blinding, because as quickly as the claw had come, just as fast did the world go pitch black. The bear's claws had cut his face deep, Before he could make sense of the sudden darkness, his old body hit the trunk of a tree. All of the wind was knocked out of him, and his consciousness went as dark as his eyes. 150 yards away, Josie, still sitting in the car, heard the screech of pain emanating from the woods. This time, when Josie got out, she remembered to grab the rifle. Cocking it as she began to run down the path, Josie shouted for her husband, but there was no reply. She called out again, but the shout died in her throat when she got to the clearing. Just like Max, she walked right into the beast head-on. But Josie had the fortune of being a few yards further away from it when she did, and the bear was more confused than anything else. It roared loudly before Josie turned tail and ran. She knew full well that if she pulled the trigger, she was more likely to wound the animal or to miss it completely, and then there would be no chance to reload before it reacted and killed her. She hadn't seen her husband, but there was no other choice but to run at that moment, and that was ultimately what saved both her and her husband. Josie had entered the clearing at just the right time. When Max hit the tree, he was knocked out cold. He had essentially been scalped, and the blindness he experienced was not his vision that went dark. It was the flap of skin that was torn off from his hairline that had fallen over his eyes. Had the grizzly been interested in actively hunting to store up fat, it would have undoubtedly finished Max off then and there. Thankfully, the bear was in the clearing searching for berries and roots. It wasn't the season for hunting down big game yet. The animal simply looked at the old man lying in a crumpled, bloody mess amongst the leaves. Then, thinking that he was dead, it turned around and lumbered back into the trees, wanting nothing more but to avoid any more humans trespassing on its space that day. Josie was 16 miles away from the reserve. She slammed down on the gas and sped down the dirt roads faster than she'd ever driven before. When she reached the town, she rounded up a group of 12 men who followed her in their trucks to find the place where Max was last seen disappearing into the forest. When they got there, Max was miraculously lying exactly where he'd been thrown. His breathing was shallow, and he was still unconscious, but at least he was still alive. When they picked him up to get him into one of the trucks, he roused for just a second, but the pain and the blood loss from his bleeding head was just too much for his old body to handle. He winked back to sleep before he could make sense of what was happening. Josie sat in the back of the truck next to Max, who was wrapped in jackets and towels. Josie, Max, and half the group drove 2 hours to reach the nearest hospital. The other half of the group stayed behind to track the bear while the tracks were still fresh. They stayed there, searching for 3 days, but found nothing at all. Max somehow managed to pull through. He had a few vicious scars on his forehead from where doctors had to reattach a flap of skin that was 5 inches long. His thick hair never grew back over those scars again. They had to stitch his ear back in place, and he lost a significant amount of hearing on that side. But Max and Josie were fine with that. Josie said it made him look like the warrior that he was at heart, and his crooked ear made him look like the sly old fox that he'd always been. Men half Max's age would have died after the enormous amount of blood he'd lost, but Max was always fit and active ever since he was a boy, and that constant need to move was what made it possible for him to survive and recover as well as he did. Max and Josie lived in their hometown on the reserve for another 9 years before Max died peacefully in his sleep at the ripe old age of 79. The grandkids weren't afraid of his scars either, but they did ask him to retell the story of how he'd survived the greatest of beasts to walk the land. They never got tired of hearing the story of how he narrowly escaped his terrifying final affliction.